We'll just wait another minute or two to see if more people end up joining, being that the team call just ended. Okay, so just thumbs up if people can hear me. Perfect. And was everyone able to see my screen like a minute ago? It was all good? Perfect, okay. I will get started then. Okay, welcome to today's GitLab University session. Today it's on installing GitLab in Red Hat OpenShift Origin and Mesosphere DCOS. So specifically that we've actually made an installation template for these two container orchestration platforms. And the templates are a little bit different, but the platforms themselves are very similar. So that's why we're talking about them, or why I'm talking about them together today. So I said a container orchestration platform. So I want to kind of explain that in case anyone isn't familiar. But what do I mean by container? So we think of containers as lightweight virtual machines that reuse the host system's kernel. So they don't actually have their own kernel inside them, but they often contain the rest of the operating system. They aren't actually virtual machines, but they're rather just tools that try to provide an isolated or, of course, contained file system and process tree. So what I'm meaning by that is that they aren't actually virtualizing the underlying machine. They've just have contained a different file system and a different process tree in order to run separately from, or in a contained environment from the host. That kind of level of containment is all that's needed to run an entirely different Linux operating system, basically. So to run an entire Ubuntu or CentOS and everything within that normal operating system. And just because it's able to do an entire operating system, essentially, they're often called VMs because they're so similar in that regard. When we think of VMs, that's often what we think of. The two products that we're talking about today, which is OpenShift Origin and DCOS, specifically target the container technologies Docker and Rocket. There are other technologies available, but Docker and Rocket provide like an image spec that makes it easy to share applications instead of just sharing the containers without an application definition or metadata around what the applications need to expose to the host. So these products specifically target these two technologies. And normally we would, in the case of GitLab, we're going to be talking about our Docker image and using Docker, but in general, we'll just be calling them container orchestration platforms because they do support more than just Docker. I have some asterisks on the bottom of the screen here about they aren't actually VMs. If you're running Docker on Windows or Mac, you actually do end up running a VM because those systems don't have a Linux kernel. So they do run a VM to run a Linux kernel, but then the rest of the system works the same and just uses the contained file systems for the rest of your Docker containers. So why even use containers? So basically, it's simply because they're lightweight and fast to boot, and with that, they're still able to provide a full snapshot of your application. So basically, because they're faster and lighter than VMs, what that allows you to do is you can run multiple of them on, say, your laptop at the same time. In the past, I've during like a security release of GitLab, in order to do a smoke test, I've run 4 versions of GitLab at the same time, and they came up in like a minute or two, and I was able to quickly verify. And I could certainly have run more than 4. Whereas I probably wouldn't have been able to run that many VMs on my laptop at the same time. Their file system by default goes away when you shut them down. And this is kind of useful. Another way I'm going to relate it to GitLab is, say a customer has an issue on a specific older version of GitLab, being able to just quickly in like 2 minutes boot up that exact version they have and test it out, and then shut it down and it's completely gone is pretty useful. But they don't have to have a file system that go away. You can mount volumes and persist the data, but that flexibility in that default state makes them quite useful for lots of different things. They give more control. They put more control in the hands of the application developer. So because it's containing everything needed to run the application, including the operating system itself, there's less responsibility put on the people deploying the images and more responsibility put on the developer. They have greater control. So an example of that would be making sure that the exact right version that you want of Ruby, for example, is included in the Docker image in the container. When you're running it, and not having that have to be something that the person deploying it has to think about. And then being able to deploy another snapshot of the application in minutes or seconds or minutes in the case of GitLab, because we're kind of heavyweight when a server goes down. So this idea of snapshot is very much the same as VMs, or taking a snapshot of, say, your Amazon image and being able to, when for some reason your node gets corrupted or something like that, being able to restore a new one from a snapshot. The difference is the fact that it's so lightweight and fast that if you are using these in production, being able to deploy essentially what is a snapshot of your application is a lot faster, and it becomes less of a problem that you're deploying these snapshots. So the other word I had in there was orchestration. So what do we mean by orchestration in terms of containers? So it just means that these platforms are in charge of creating, monitoring, and destroying the containers. These 2 platforms, which are OpenShift Origin and DCOS, actually do quite a bit more. They're made up of lots of different pieces. And in fact, just one of the pieces of software running in them does this container orchestration. Another word that's often referred to the orchestration piece is called container scheduling. But in terms of our own integration with these platforms is basically through our Docker image. So our focus is kind of on utilizing their container orchestration to run GitLab. So what this really is, what these templates really are meant to do, is we can think of, we just want to run GitLab in as many places as possible. If you're running a cloud of a certain type or a platform of a certain type, we would love to be able to have you deploy GitLab in that platform. And these are 2 platforms that we're trying to enable you to install GitLab in. So the 2 products we're talking about, again, are Red Hat OpenShift Origin and Mesosphere Data Center Operating System, which is commonly referred to as DCOS. So why are we talking about both of them? And it's basically because they do a lot of the same things, even though our templates, so technically our templates for them are a little bit different, and we'll get to that later. The purpose of the templates right now is a little bit different. The platforms themselves are very similar. So one of the things they do is they focus on deploying and managing applications. So that's in contrast to maybe something like DigitalOcean's Droplets, which focus on deploying and managing operating systems, right? You get to pick operating system for your droplet, and that's kind of the goal. In the terms of these products, you're actually deploying applications, so the focus is on the application you're deploying. They both allow multiple apps to run on the same node, and they do this by using the container technology, which isolates the apps from each other. They both abstract your nodes, your servers, as pools of computing resources instead of individual machines. So what that means is each individual machine is basically just reporting its computational ability, its RAM, and its storage size to the platform, and the platform kind of groups it into pools of like different sizes of resources, and the applications don't actually have to care about which machine, which IP they end up arriving on. All they care about is what sort of resources they require, meaning when because they're not meant to be tied to an individual machine, when a machine goes down, they're able to just find another resource in the pool to deploy on. They both allow you to spin up multiple instances of your app in seconds with built-in load balancing. So an example of this is, say we were deploying just the GitLab application separate from its database and the Redis instance. So basically what we have on gitlab.com is our workers. In these solutions, you can scale them up with basically a single command telling them to make this many X number of instances, and it'll actually boot up that number of instances, and it'll take care of the load balancing. So when requests come in, you don't have to do anything. It just takes care of making sure that all of your instances are increasing your capacity, and requests will be served by multiple instances. And that was all capable with just changing one instance variable. Excuse me. And then the last thing I want to bring up with what they both have in common is they both allow you to bring up your application in a new container or a new node automatically when your old node when your old node goes away unexpectedly. So if you imagine that you have your applications deployed in Amazon, and you have nodes in multiple regions that share similar resource specs. If one region goes down, these platforms will actually boot up your application in the other region right away when it sees some of its servers go away and your application goes down. So they're actually, like I mentioned before, both systems are actually made up of lots of other pieces of software. And I thought it was actually important to mention what some of those are, because they are pieces that we sometimes in GitLab you'll see we use separately, or we have config templates for them separately, but you'll also see them maybe in sales calls and other things like that brought up. So in the case of OpenShift, one of the popular technology that it includes, in addition to like 20 other pieces, is Kubernetes. And Kubernetes for OpenShift is the actual orchestration platform. It is the container scheduler. And then in the case of DCOS, the orchestration platform, the scheduler, is something called Marathon. And then that is layered on top of something else called Apache Mesos. And Apache Mesos is actually something they call an application kernel that sits on top of your Linux kernel. And Apache Mesos does a few things that the default stuff in the OpenShift image don't do, that make it kind of broader for like really big computing. One of the things, though, that I'm not familiar with everything that it has benefits, or every benefit that it has. One of the things that it's built for is basically failover of masters and stuff like that. So you have many master nodes for this for DCOS, and it handles falling over when not only one of your agent nodes failed, but say your master node failed in Amazon or something like that. Interestingly enough, so when we're talking about OpenShift, we're talking about Kubernetes as well. But if you're talking about Kubernetes, you're not talking necessarily about OpenShift. You can run Kubernetes separately, and a lot of people do. Same with DCOS and Marathon Apache Mesos. Lots of people run Apache Mesos and Marathon separate from DCOS. But if you are talking about DCOS, we are talking about Marathon and Apache Mesos underneath. Interestingly enough, you can also actually run Kubernetes on top of Apache Mesos. So you don't have to use Marathon, because they were both, Marathon and Kubernetes were the orchestration platform, and you can actually swap them out. And actually, most of the pieces that make up OpenShift could be placed on Apache Mesos. But that's the kind of, these platforms that we're looking at today are actually kind of like the bundled up versions of all the different pieces of software. So they're kind of like different bundled distros of these container orchestration platforms, which is kind of the reason why we're talking about both of them today, is because they share a lot of commonality. So the first, so we have two goals today to walk through, and the first one is installing GitLab in DCOS. So what is it? What is it that we built? We built a template that lives in Mesosphere's universe repo, and that ships by default starting next release with DCOS. And what that means is starting on September 15th, which is when they release, anyone who's running that new version of DCOS will have basically a one-click installer for GitLab. And I say it's a one-click installer. In truth, it can install in one click, but on these platforms, GitLab usually needs to bind to a URL. So there's usually a configuration step where you have to put in which URL you want GitLab to run on. Technically, they would run and start up and run without it, but you wouldn't actually be able to reach it, so it's not very useful. Who is it for? This is mostly for users who are already running DCOS. You're not likely to want to deploy these clustered container management systems just to run GitLab. It's instead the other way around. If you're already running these clustered systems, you might want to add GitLab to your system, and there might be some really good reasons why simply by having these systems, you definitely want GitLab, and we'll get to that both for DCOS and OpenShift in a little bit here. And then a question I had when people were reviewing the slides yesterday was, how is this different than our Omnibus install? And it's not really different from our Omnibus install. This is actually just these templates run our Docker image, which is actually our Omnibus running inside of Ubuntu 16.04. So this is our Omnibus install. It's just packaged up with some health checks and some other stuff. So what pain are we trying to solve here? So it's there's not particularly a big pain here. Our big goal here is to make GitLab easily installable in as many places as possible, and this is just another place to install it. So it's very easy to install GitLab in minutes here. And one kind of side note here is that the fact that we have an integrated container registry is actually a compelling reason why you might want to, like, regardless of other reasons, you might want to install GitLab in DCOS. And that's because DCOS doesn't ship with a container registry, which is very odd because this is a container orchestration platform, and it doesn't ship with a registry that you can put your containers in or store your containers in. So when I was I actually did a Mesosphere webinar, a joint webinar with Mesosphere yesterday, and some of the people were asking, like, can we just deploy GitLab without all the rest, just with the container registry? And that's because people on DCOS want a container registry. They don't want to have to use public registries. So simply having that container registry is compelling in addition to everything else we have in GitLab. So what sort of customers run DCOS and might want GitLab? So customers who need a cluster to run the sheer volume of apps and microservices they have. So an example of this, who isn't running DCOS, but is a kind of an example of who has this volume of apps and microservices would be a customer like eBay, where developers tend to work on their own individual apps, and those apps are just responsible for one piece of the website, essentially. Like each filter you use in GitLab is usually running on a single application, and they do use containers for a lot of that. Another example of a customer like this would be a university where each student wants to be able to deploy their app and work on it. And so universities have been moving to these sorts of systems like DCOS and OpenShift Origin. Also, customers who already have many apps running in the cloud and want to reduce the resource billing. So because it's treating your nodes just as computing resources and will stick multiple applications on the same resource as it sees there's room for it, people do report having less costs on services like Amazon as a result of doing this versus booting up EC2 instances for each of their applications. And then finally, customers that build software that is dependent on containers. So there is companies that make software that is totally reliant on containers, and kind of the advantage of their software is containers, and they might not want to do their own sort of orchestration, and so they might be using DCOS and want GitLab. So demo time for the installing GitLab in DCOS. Just before I swap over to my demo, I'm going to quickly wreck all your screens by jumping over to the sharing screen and checking chat.
Hey DJ, this is Hayden. Quick question for you, mate. Are those orchestration platforms, the two we're talking about, are they open source?
Yes. So OpenShift, so they both have a similar model to us, where the software is open source, and then they both have enterprise versions of the software. So both OpenShift Origin is the open source offering, and then there's an OpenShift Enterprise and like a kind of like a managed platform as a service platform that has gone through a couple different names. I think it might be called OpenShift Dedicated right now. And then in the case of Mesosphere's DCOS, they have DCOS, which is open source, and then they have DCOS Enterprise, which is their enterprise offering.
Got it. Good. Thanks.
So Ryan asked before, could I explain what a node is? So when I was talking about a node, I just mean like an actual server, a box. It could be a physical box. It could be an Amazon instance. It could be something like that. So any sort of node, any sort of server that has like a set storage size, RAM size, and like computing rating for CPU, essentially.
Okay, thank you.
So Chad asked, is the targeted audience for us to reach out to customers running DCOS and do not already have GitLab and who need revision control tracking? Yes, but if they already do have GitLab, they might also want to put GitLab into DCOS, and part of the reason for that would be that container registration, but it also when in these platforms, all the applications are often within the same network, and it makes communication a lot easier. So if you're a private company and you are using a public cloud instance for some of this stuff, you're still able to make some things public, but you could actually keep GitLab kind of private to the rest of your services if you're using GitLab to, say, power your deployments or something like that. So there are reasons why, if you already had both services, you might want to take GitLab and put it in DCOS. The more compelling reasons are ones that we don't have templates for yet, and that would be being able to put GitLab CI in here, which we don't have yet, but would be very exciting to have the GitLab CI runners running in these platforms. So I'm going to switch over to the demo for DCOS now. So in the case of DCOS, I'm running basically it's on my own laptop here. That's not really a recommended way. It's just for development and for this demo purpose. I'm going to show it to you running from my laptop. For the most part, this would be normally running in Amazon or some other cloud provider. It's actually really heavy on resources, so it's using up pretty much all 16 gigs of my RAM, and I wasn't sure if I'd actually be able to do the broadcast today with BlueJeans because of that much RAM being used. But it seems to be working. That's great. So this is DCOS. This is their dashboard page. We can see that I have 2 nodes connected. So this is a very, very, very small cluster. This is the minimum number of nodes that are required for running GitLab, essentially. So, and the reason for that is, in order to make it public, you need, so you want to run GitLab on like a private node, and then you need at least one public node to have a public accessible URL on. I just see a lot of chat messages, so I'm going to jump over and just make sure there's nothing breaking. Okay, perfect. As long as you guys can see my screen, that's great. If for some reason you can't see something and there's like something broken, be sure to like unmute yourselves and let me know, so I don't like continue on completely without making any sense and not showing my screen or something. So this is so I have these 2 nodes here. I also this is a pretty empty version of DCOS currently. This universe service that's being run is actually just my merge request for adding in GitLab, so that normally wouldn't be running. So the only actual application that's required to then run GitLab is this Marathon LB, which is a load balancer. And what that is by default in DCOS, normally you have to create a native Marathon application in order to open your ports up on the public on like the public IP. But if you're using a Docker image, which we are, you don't have the API basically to open up ports in Marathon. So we instead make use of a native API that then supports it for Docker images. So that's what this Marathon LB application is. It just provides the API to Marathon for letting Docker images open ports on the public instance, basically the public IP. But so what that actually means is that this is what allows me to actually will allow me to reach GitLab in the browser. And this had zero configuration. I just installed it, and it just is meant to work by default. It's just a piece that they don't have installed by default with all those 20 other software pieces, in case you're only using native applications and not using Docker. So I'm going to essentially install GitLab. So starting on the 15th, anyone who's running DCOS on a cluster and has this, when they see this screen and they go to Universe, they're actually going to be able to see, Universe is actually the list of packages that are available for one-click installers. They're going to be able to see GitLab. Oh, if it was running. I left this thing running all night on my own machine with limited RAM. And it may not be super happy about it. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So we have basically a list of packages that you can search. And here in the kind of the featured selected packages, starting on the 15th, we'll be right here with GitLab. Because I didn't want to wreck the demo, I'm still running 8.10. But like later today, we'll be updating the merge request to do 8.11. So I just hit install package. So if you hit install package again, basically it would install, but I wouldn't be able to reach it because I haven't configured a URL for it. I haven't told it what URL it'll sit on. So I have to click on advanced installation. And then we have a bunch of different settings that we can change. Because this, so these are settings I can change up front, and these are the only settings I can change up front. But because this is an omnibus install, once it's installed, you can go in on your file system to find gitlab.rb and make all the changes necessary there. And all that's required to do a reconfigure is to either you can SSH into the box and run reconfigure, or if you just restart the box from the UI, or even better, just like boot up a new like a second instance of it, it'll end up running reconfigure, and then you can like scale down the first instance. So there's a bunch of different settings for configuration options, how much memory it's going to require, how much CPU resources, the actual name that you're going to call the application in case you want to run multiple GitLab instances that don't share the same resources. But one of the only things we have to put in is the virtual host name. So this is on my local box, so I have a kind of a vhost redirect to make sure that gitlab.example.com is going to point at my local box. So this will work for me, but this would normally be a DNS name that points at your public node on DCOS. So that's the only thing I have to enter here. You'll notice our SSH ports and registry ports for the container registry are pretty high. That's because port 22, which is our normal Git over SSH port, are already being used by DCOS, and that's often the case. That's the case in OpenShift as well. So we have to put them on a custom port in order to allow you to access your Git repos over SSH. So you're able to configure SMTP email. For DCOS, you can configure high availability as well, and you do that by linking it to running Redis and Postgres database. If you don't enable this, we're just going to do our all-in-one install where Postgres and Redis are on the same box. Unfortunately, like it would be nice if we just enabled this and you didn't have to set this up, and we were able to like build these separate boxes for you, but that's currently not the case in DCOS. You have to have already set up Postgres and already have set up Redis. So we're in a single node mode, and in single node mode, there's a couple different options for how you do your storage. The ideal option is just to enable this external volumes, which if you had external volumes set up in your cluster, you just hit enable and this would just all kind of work. And as your application comes up and down, the right volume would be attached. External volumes requires a special driver to be installed in your cluster, which I don't have installed. So when that's the case in your cluster, and because external volumes is kind of experimental in this first release, that's going to kind of be the case. Unfortunately, you're going to have to either mount your directories on all of your servers in order to keep that data there, or you're going to just have to pin the server to one node. So this pinning that I'm going to use kind of sucks, and it's not really what you'd want for production use, but it is fine for evaluation use. And what it allows you to do is stick it on the one server, and each time it comes up on the same server, which actually kind of flies in the face of the things we were previously talking about, where the application is able to migrate across servers. So it isn't what you want to set up for production, but it is what we're going to use for this demo, so that we could restart the thing and it would actually find its data. But so in order to do that, I didn't install it because I need this this IP address basically to pin the host name to. So that's one of the things where this integration is currently lacking, and it's basically we're waiting on some more features of DCOS to be released and worked on to be able to make this better. So as I'm doing this, I'm just installing it again. Now I have the pinned host name, and I have to go back. I have to re-put in my virtual host. But essentially, I've for this demo, I've set 2 fields, and now I can review and install. This is just a summary of my configuration. I'll hit install. So it says success, GitLab has been installed. Well, that's fine. It's actually still deploying though, and it'll take probably a few minutes to deploy it, as we have to run reconfigure and set up the database. But usually it actually is still fairly fast. So if we jump in, so just to jump back out, this is the list of services running. So now we, in addition to Marathon LB, we also have GitLab now running. If we jump back to nodes, you can see we had an uptick in our resource usage, increase in our memory usage, and it must not have attached storage yet, so no increase in disk yet, so it's still being set up. But from the dashboard, we can see we have 3 tasks running. And see kind of an overview of what happened there. And because it's not finished setting up, it's not listed as healthy. So we have health checks that will eventually determine that this service is healthy and let you know that it's up and running. So if I jump back to the services, which is where kind of our GitLab instance is running, we're able to jump in to the service itself. And then the service can have multiple tasks running or instances running. Currently, we only have it set to 1. So if I jump into it, I can see additional information about it, and I can look at the logs and actually see that it's looks like it actually just finished setting up its health check, but it ran reconfigure as well and started booting up. So if I go back to dashboard, we can see that GitLab is now listed as healthy and operating normally, and I can actually go to GitLab.example.com, which is just pointing right back to this same instance, but the virtual host will actually now show that I have a GitLab instance running here. So that is essentially the install of GitLab on DCOS at the moment, as of what will be released in DCOS 1.8 on September 15th. So I'll exit out of this demo and return to my slides and quickly check chat again to see if there's anything I want to answer before I move on to Openshift. Yeah, okay, so it doesn't look like there's any question I need to answer quite yet, which is great. So I'll move back to my slides and move on. So as you might have seen when we were looking through on the list of installed products, one of the products in there was Bitbucket Server. So that's the only other competing product that's already on DCOS. It actually just got added, but that's the only other one that you can install on DCOS at the moment. We did run into a couple of limitations that you saw when we were setting it up. So there's no one-click install of the high availability setup. Essentially, you have to set up your Postgres and your Redis separately. Once you did do that in that high availability setup, we wouldn't have had to do that host pinning. We wouldn't have had to worry about external volumes. We would have, if you do go through the effort of setting up the high availability, what you do get is that ability to start up multiple instances of it and have it, handle that graceful failover and stuff like that, and take full advantage of the system. But without setting up HA, it's more of a you either have to pin it to the host or use the external volumes to use it. There's no persistent volume support. So persistent volumes is another feature of DCOS that would have kind of solved that host pinning problem, where we wouldn't have need to pin to those, and it works very similar to the external volumes, except it didn't require you to set up, like it's built into DCOS and didn't require you to set up an external volume. The problem, we actually had support for these persistent volumes initially when we built this integration. The problem was DCOS currently has an issue where they don't let you ever upgrade really the applications with persistent volumes. Which is kind of an issue for us, being that we have a new version of GitLab released every month. And so not being able to have users update their application seemed really, really bad. So we dropped support for persistent volume for now until that problem is solved. And once it's solved, we won't have to do that host pinning, and it'll make things a lot easier. Another limitation is there's no CI runner deployment yet in DCOS. And that would be actually really awesome if there was. I think that's something that's really compelling, is being able to have a runner kind of master in DCOS and it be able to start new instances of the runner as needed to run your CI builds and stuff like that. So documentation is coming soon. Documentation will be out before the release, or at least on the release of GitLab in DCOS, which is happening on September 15th. There'll be both a tutorial for doing there'll be basic documentation for the configuration, but also a tutorial for doing continuous delivery and CI in GitLab on DCOS. But it will be using, for this first tutorial, because we don't have CI runner, it'll be using Jenkins as the integrated CI in the tutorial. So a quick summary of the our current DCOS install. Basically, its purpose is to let you quickly install GitLab on your DCOS cluster for source control, issue tracking, and its integrated container registry. So basically, just everything that's great about GitLab, you're able to install on your DCOS cluster. So that's it for the DCOS one. We'll jump into goal 2, which is installing GitLab on Openshift, which I'm also going to show. And this one, we'll run through this one a little bit quicker because a lot of things are the same essentially. But there's a couple things that are different. So what is this particular installation template? Well, it's a template that lives in our Omnibus repo, and it's going to ship by default with the OpenShift all-in-one developer VM. And will also be installable in a self-managed OpenShift cluster, but it's not actually going to ship with OpenShift origin right now. And I'm going to dive into that right now, basically. Essentially, starting with GitLab 8.12, we're able to support installing GitLab in OpenShift without too much additional configuration, and so that's how we're going to get it into the OpenShift all-in-one developer VM. OpenShift is going to have it as basically that sort of one-click installer in there by default, just like we had with DCOS. But OpenShift has a few more restrictions than DCOS does. So one of the restrictions is that if you're running software that needs to run as the root user, that only a cluster admin can install it. And what that means is, in the case of a self-managed OpenShift cluster, your company is going to have a cluster admin who can install GitLab. But in the case of their hosted solutions and often their enterprise solutions, they don't usually give out cluster admin rights to customers. So people wouldn't, even if they had the one-click installer in there, they wouldn't be able to actually install it themselves, which would be problematic. It would try to install and it would fail. So as a result, they're not currently, in its current state, we're not shipping it with OpenShift as a one-click installer, but we will have documentation that essentially walks you through the steps of installing it yourself in your own self-managed cluster. And that's kind of the current state of things, starting with the 8.12 release. So who is it for? So currently, because of those limitations, it's for developers who are working on OpenShift applications. Because of that OpenShift all-in-one VM is basically a VM that can run on your laptop that runs this cluster, and you can develop applications on it. It's also for existing OpenShift users who want to run GitLab on their self-managed cluster. And there's actually quite a few people who already do this because it is fairly easy to set up a template. It was in the past fairly easy to set up a template to run GitLab in OpenShift if you manage your own cluster and you were a cluster admin. So there are already users who do this. And when we were looking at building the template, there was already lots of examples of this on, if we search Google. So our template is now like an officially managed and supported version that's those same people are going to be able to install. So how is this different from our Omnibus install? It's, once again, it's not different in that it still includes our Omnibus install. It's still running our Docker image, which is Omnibus in 1604. It's just that plus a few more things. In this case, we're actually able to, in our template, specify bringing up a separate Postgres database and a separate Redis database. So we're able to do some of the things that we weren't able to do quite yet in DCOS. But oddly enough, it's still only for the developer VM template. So we haven't quite reached all the goals we want for this template either. So there's quite a few limitations still. So what pain does it solve? This one actually has an interesting pain. So this is specific to the fact that we're targeting more developers for this. And also, so the pain point that it's solving is that you no longer need to use a public Git repository for OpenShift's source to image tool. For deploying your application in OpenShift. So what is that? So that's basically OpenShift has taken a stance that they're focusing on not just installing applications in your OpenShift cluster, but they're really focused on installing your applications, as in your company's own applications and website and stuff like that in your cluster. So they have this product called Source to Image, which essentially pulls from your Git repository, pulls your source code, and it creates a Docker image and then deploys it into OpenShift origin. So basically goes right from source code to live in production, or live in staging, or live wherever. And it does that all automatically, but it basically, you need to put in a Git repository at the beginning and get your deployment in the end. And so for the most part, because it's hard to set up kind of authentication and stuff like that for the Git repository, these repositories had to be public, which is a bit of a problem. Both for developers working on OpenShift who are just like trying to break things and they have to be committing tons of changes to these public GitHub repositories or public GitLab repositories, or for companies who just don't want their stuff public. The fact that this thing is only pulling from public repositories is a bit of a problem. So that's kind of a pain point of installing GitLab right in the container, is that your source to image software basically is going to have access to the Git repository without it being public to everyone else. So what sort of customers run OpenShift and might want GitLab? So the first three things are the exact same as DCOS, the lots of apps already running in the cloud, and software that's dependent on containers. With the addition that we're also talking about, because we're talking about the all-in-one developer virtual machine, that also specifically customers that build software for OpenShift, so other customers that are building applications, and Red Hat OpenShift themselves who are working on the platform. This is very much something that they want in the product, and that's kind of why the plan is to ship it right in the developer VM, because it's something that makes their lives easier as well. So before I move on to the demo, just one of the reasons it makes their lives easier in the terms of Red Hat and the things that when we talk to them, they're very excited about is they have to demo. They often, both DCOS and Openshift, when they're demoing at conferences and stuff like that, the demo they want to show is a CI/CD demo. So it's a demo that has to include something like GitLab or GitHub. It's something that has to include CI like Jenkins or hopefully in the future GitLab CI, and is able to deploy all these things. But they're often on conference Wi-Fi, and having to pull from some public repo at all is kind of a problem. So they're very excited about the fact that like with this VM on your machine at these conferences and when doing demos and doing stuff like that, that they don't even have to be connected to any network at all, and they can still show this great demo. So it does have, even though right now our current iteration is very limited, it does still have some benefits and purpose. And hopefully in the future, we'll be able to reach all the kind of the same point that we have in the DCOS install and have it installable everywhere on OpenShift. So quicker demo time. So hopefully this demo goes quicker, but I'm going to switch over to, I should have, instead of putting demos, I should have did individual questions as I switched around, because I'm actually going to quickly see if there's any more questions. So there's not. Okay. So I am going to do the demo. So interestingly enough, I had the DCOS demo running on my own machine, which is not something you would normally do. You would normally have it running in AWS, but it took so much RAM that I couldn't run the OpenShift Vagrant all-in-one dev VM on my own machine at the same time and have them both up and running. So oddly enough, I'm going to, even though we're targeting the all-in-one VM, I'm actually going to hit the self-managed cluster as a cluster admin that we set up with Mark last month for our UX demo of our idea to production. So that's located at origin.gitlab.com. So I've already set up a project, which is just like a namespacing similar to like groups in GitLab. So this is OpenShift Origin. I'm jumping to this project and it's empty. So normally people have already have a project in OpenShift Origin. They'll already have other apps, but they'll still have this add to project button. They can add to project, and we can see that one of the first things that shows up in this case, this is of course we've added it manually, but one of the first things that shows up after we've added it manually is this ability to install GitLab CE. So it includes the GitLab CE image, the GitLab CE Redis image, and the GitLab CE Postgres image. So I'm going to just, once again, this is our host name. This one's actually live out in the wild, so this is public. So I'm going to do glu.apps.origin.gitlab.com. So as long as I keep it at apps.origin.gitlab.com, this will actually be reachable after I create it. So we'll hit create. We'll continue to overview, and it's bringing up a deployment of GitLab CE. It's bringing up a deployment of Postgres, and it's bringing up a deployment of Redis. So this is a little bit different than the DCOS one. This is actually where we'd like to get the DCOS one as well, where we're able to bring up Postgres and Redis separately. And this is going to take a little bit to install, once again, the GitLab CE portion of it. So if I jump in to the box, I once again can jump into the individual instance. This is kind of all that information about it. And I can look at the logs and see it's currently setting up GitLab. So it's going to actually have to populate the database and whatnot, so it's going to take a while. And it's going to be like this faded out, not ready blue until it's finished, because we also have those health checks we were talking about in DCOS are also present here in OpenShift. So it's not going to be up yet. So you see it's unavailable, but eventually it'll come up. So having having this the application actually separate from the Postgres database and the Redis database means that we're actually able to do things like scale up the GitLab instance. With simply the Postgres and Redis separate, you can scale up and run multiple versions of GitLab, multiple instances of GitLab pointing against the same Postgres and Redis instance. And this is somewhat similar to what we have running in GitLab.com, where we have about 20 of these runners running. Not similar in terms of we're not using containers and we're not using something like Kubernetes or OpenShift on GitLab.com, but just the fact that you can scale up multiple workers and have multiple workers, and that they're being load balanced by a load balancer called this service here, is something that's similar. One thing, this isn't exactly an HA setup quite like GitLab.com, because we still only have one Postgres instance and one Redis instance, and they aren't able to actually scale. So because they're not in master slave mode, you can't scale these guys up and expect it to work. It's only this guy that you can scale up to handle. So you can handle more requests coming in through the UI, but you can't handle more load on necessarily the database or the Redis instance. So it's not quite an HA setup. It is a lot closer to a HA setup, and if we ever add HA to GitLab, already having them split out like this will make things a lot easier in terms of how the data is stored. This is more similar to how our pivotal tile actually works as well. So it claims to be up, so I should be able to refresh this now, and we get to the same page. We get GitLab up and running. So I'm not going to go ahead and log in. I'm just going to jump back out of the demo and jump back to my slides. So competing products, there's actually nothing else yet in that's has a template, like an officially supported template for OpenShift. People do, like I mentioned, there was already people were already using GitLab, using their own templates. People are already using things like Cog and Garrett using their own templates. So people do deploy other things, other competing products in in OpenShift, but there's nothing else officially supported yet. And I guess at the moment, even our own is only going to be default installed in the all-in-one VM. But at this point, we're the closest thing to an officially supported product in OpenShift Origin. So it does have a couple of limitations. One that I didn't talk about when I was doing the demo, but the OpenShift Origin install doesn't have Git SSH support yet, only HTTP. So in DCOS, we talked about the fact that I was able to just open a custom port on that crazy 2222, and on that port, we were able to do SSH. In OpenShift Origin, their load balancer that they have, their public load balancer at the very front, doesn't yet support custom ports. It only has port 80 and port 443 open. So there's actually no way outside of the system to do Git over SSH yet. They are working on that, but that's a current limitation. So you can only do Git over HTTP. Another limitation that I mentioned is it requires a cluster administrator to set up. Another limitation, which is the same as DCOS, is we still don't have a CI runner, and a CI runner would be awesome. And then the other two limitations are just the fact that because this version is targeted at the all-in-one VM, and it's not quite as mature, and it doesn't have kind of like a release date coming up here on the 15th, unlike the DCOS one. We haven't put all the same configuration options in, or the EE version into this one yet, but we will be putting those in. But at the moment, all those options that you saw in DCOS are not in the OpenShift version yet. So it's just a matter of spending a little bit more time and adding them in. Docs are also coming soon, but they'll likely come after the all-in-one VM docs have been updated. So a little bit after. So first we'll be releasing GitLab 8.12 because that's what's required to install in OpenShift. And then we'll be updating the docs after that, along with the next all-in-one image release from OpenShift. So kind of a summary of the OpenShift install. It's an officially maintained installation template for GitLab in OpenShift. So that's in addition to it being for the all-in-one VM and already in there by default. That's not really something that like it is exciting, but it's not really something to sell. But the fact that we have this officially maintained template for GitLab that now users who are already making their own templates and deploying in OpenShift, customers who manage their own clusters can do this, and it will be officially supported. And we will be doing, officially supported updates to the product and stuff like that, and making sure migrations run and all that before we release. So something that they no longer have to worry as much about, I think, is still something that's compelling. So that's it. That's everything. Feel free to ask any questions now, and I will try to answer them. Go ahead.
DJ, do we plan to have a regular cadence of the tiles, just like our normal omnibus releases every month?
Yeah, so for the images, we have a target there's actually, we have a page for our cloud images that kind of defines our target, and we want to be updating these within, I think it's in our handbook, but we want to be updating these within 3 days of our release. So that's meant to be the case. I believe that's meant to be the target for these two, OpenShift and DCOS. One, you mentioned the tile. The tile is a lot harder to do. There's a lot more documentation. Like it's just, in the case of the pivotal tile, it's not just getting it running, but getting it approved by them and getting a lot of licensing approvals done and stuff like that. So unfortunately, while these ones we intend to be able to do within 3 days of release, the pivotal tile, which we didn't show today, has a quite a bit longer release cycle, and will probably continue to lag behind quite a bit until we manage to automate more of the licensing process and stuff like that.
Got it. Yeah, but I think I might have used the wrong term. Yeah, I was referring to the images, but that's good you addressed both. So tiles are a bit of a longer lag between a release date and a new tile coming out, and images are supposed to be within a few days of the release.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, if not, feel free to ping me on Slack if you do have any additional questions, or if they're more related less to the technology and stuff we're using and more to the questions about our direction with these, ping Aileron and not me. But thanks for joining, and I'll see all of you guys later.
Awesome. Thanks, DJ. Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks, DJ.